Obviously, the question of lists, as we've already seen at this conference, it's a huge subject. So, where to begin, what first and what last. So let me, sorry, just one further word at the beginning. I apologize for the hugely long handout. And I suspect I'll get nowhere near the end of it. So I want to begin from a perhaps unlikely character to figure prominently in a conference devoted in part to status and identity, namely Thersites, according to Homer, the ugliest Greek to go to Troy. Well, you have the whole passage on the handout, but I'm concerned particularly with verses 215 to 8. To Ilios, died, I'll come back to that, and lame in one foot, and his shoulders were rounded, hunching together over his chest, and above them his head was pointed, and a scant stubble grew on it. One thing that can be said about those verses is that there's little agreement about what they mean, other than their obviously generally negative import. Thersites is, to quote Geoffrey Kirk, a monstrosity by heroic standards. Now, the ancient grammarians thought that pholkos, the first of those adjectives in 217, meant squint-eyed, whereas some modern scholars think the reference must be to his legs, bandy-legged, as for example, in the Loeb translation there, so that each part of the body gets two details. As Kirk says, presumably the word refers to the lower limbs, since the description seems to pass on to the upper body. What lies behind this modern urge, then, is precisely a desire to impose order upon this list of Thersites' physical malformations. Whereas squint-eyed, lame in one leg, with hunched shoulders, lacks any pattern, and it's a pattern that we seek in a list. This, of course, is not to say that modern scholars are necessarily wrong about the meaning of pholkos. One of the reasons, in fact, that ancient grammarians thought that pholkos referred to a feature of the head was precisely that in their experience, physical descriptions normally start at the top and work down. But the one thing that we know about Thersites, as these verses make clear, is that everything about him lacks cosmos, lacks order. This description is the ekphrastic equivalent of his mode of speech. There is no order to it. He is a monstrosity by heroic standards, in Geoffrey Kirk's words, both in how he speaks and in how he looks. Nor is it just an accident that this description of Thersites contains 4 words which appear nowhere else in Homer. The verses are as strange, some might say as stylistically ugly, as is the man himself. Repetition and familiarity are 2 of the most powerful tools of the oral poet. Homer has been said to operate by anesthetics of regularity, and the description here, by its very novelty, as well as by its ordering, or perhaps lack thereof, tells its own tale. In later literature, as we shall see, it was very common to compare the beauty of style to the beauty of the physical body, whether male or female. Roman elegists famously drew an analogy between the gracilitas of their poems and the gracilitas of their girlfriends' bodies. With such ladies, everything is where it should be, but not so with Thersites. The Greek sense of order, and perhaps ours as well, is, I think, intimately connected to our sense of the human body and its coordination. And this, of course, picks up a theme which Professor Geller and Professor Sadowski already touched upon yesterday. And in this lecture, I would like to push away at some of these themes with particular respect to Greek poetry and rhetoric. Excuse me. The hallmark of Thersites' speech is its lack of metron and cosmos, order. There is a randomness to it which matches the randomness and deformity of his body. Both might remind us of Empedocles' primeval creatures, where no less than human status and identity is I've given you the passage 2 on the handout, a couple of the best known such relevant fragments of Empedocles. Order, cosmos, is not something to be taken for granted. It has a history and indeed a prehistory. As far as the literary form is concerned, it is also fundamentally connected with Aristotelian teleology, whether that of the Poetics or how the Poetics was subsequently read. Literary forms for Aristotle reach their telos, their conclusion or end, when their sequence is determined by necessity or probability. The randomness of some lists simply cannot be borne. The study of Greek lists and catalogues must be, to an important extent at least, an investigation of the archaeology of Aristotle's claims. Unsurprisingly, we must start, as always, with Plato. The analogy between speech and body, which we have seen running through Homer's account of Thersites, was, of course, to enjoy its own afterlife, manifested most famously in Socrates' critique of Messianic speech in Plato's Phaedrus, passage 3 on the handout, right at the end. Socrates says, "I do think you will agree to this, that every discourse must be organized like a living being, a body of its own, as it were, so as not to be headless or footless, but to have a middle and members composed in fitting relation to each other and to the whole." Yes, certainly, says Phaedrus. Randomness, a lack of necessary order, saying whatever occurs to one, here in that passage are the faults which for Socrates, ironically or otherwise, betray both a lack of beauty and a lack of any science, what we would be tempted to call techne, and which these faults, which also lie at the heart of what is wrong with the Homeric Thersites. Socrates is putting his own spin then on what is inherent in the depiction of Thersites. Ugliness and randomness in a body correspond to lack of truth in speech. The sophist Gorgias begins his encomium on Helen by noting that cosmos, order or decoration for a body, is beauty, and for speech it is truth. This too is Gorgias's own gloss on what is there already in Homer. When conversely from the classical period onwards, Greek rhetoricians sought Homeric authority for what they taught, it was certainly not to Thersites whom they turned. In a famous passage of Book 3 of the Iliad, passage 4 on your handout, the Trojan Antenor recalls the embassy of Menelaus and Odysseus to Troy to negotiate Helen's return. This is the famous passage in which Odysseus's words fall like snowflakes, though when he stood up to speak, anyone would think he was an idiot. That passage, passage 4, was the principal evidence for the persistent claim in later antiquity that Homer knew both the grand style, exemplified by Odysseus, and the slender style, Menelaus, of oratory, just as Nestor's performance in Book 1 is a consummate demonstration of the middle style in oratory. Odysseus and Menelaus were not the first inventors of style. Homer, of course, had a better claim to that distinction. But for the subsequent tradition, the embassy to Troy, which Menelaus and Odysseus conducted, was indeed a beginning. And against that background, what is exceptional and simply wrong about Thersites stands out very clearly. Now, Odysseus and Menelaus were not just two of the basileis against whom Thersites liked to yell, but the mission to Troy, which is recalled in Book 3, was a public, we would call it diplomatic mission, requiring formidable rhetorical and political skills. No wonder later wannabe politicians saw themselves in Odysseus and Menelaus. What, however, also emerges very obviously from the contrast between them and Thersites is that Odysseus and Menelaus have socially and politically empowered status. They belong to the elite, whereas Thersites does not. Cosmos, order, is not some quasi-essentialist, quasi-Platonic form floating free to a light wherever it chooses. We must always ask, whose cosmos? Or in the language of Socrates from the Phaedrus, whose ananke, whose necessity? Who determines that Lysias's speech lacks proper order? Gatekeepers and self-appointed controllers may be rhetorical as well as political. In the treatise on the good king according to Homer, very likely written for members of the Roman social and political elite, the 1st century BC Epicurean Philodemus tells us that through Odysseus, Homer teaches that it is necessary to put down the threats and disorderliness of the multitude. Cosmos, order, is a very political virtue. Lists are never just lists. They claim authority precisely through cosmos and the sense of authoritative knowledge which attends that satisfying ordering. The final sign of his own identity, which Odysseus gives in the Odyssey, is when he recounts a shared past experience to his distressed father. Passage 5 on your handout. I will tell you there's also the trees which you once gave me in our well-ordered garden. And I, who was only a child, was following you through the garden and asking you for this and that. It was through these very trees that we passed, and you named them and told me of each one. Pear trees you gave me, 13, and 10 apple trees and 40 fig trees, and rows of vine, who you promised to give me, even as I say 50 of them, ripened one by one at separate times, and upon them are clusters of all sorts. Whatever the seasons is use weighed them down. There the listing carries its own sign of truth. At the beginning of his apology in Book 9, Odysseus famously poses the question of narrative order, page 6 on the handout. What then shall I recount first? What last? Many other troubles which the gods of heaven have given me, and so forth. In fact, as we know, Odysseus opts more or less for a chronological ordering of his tales, but it is the goodly shape of his words, as well as the intelligence of what he says, which convinces the Phaeacian king that he is speaking the truth. Again, it is a Basileus, a king, who passes judgment. That exchange, in which Alcinous passes judgment upon Odysseus' speech, comes, of course, as Odysseus is telling of his visit to the underworld. And nowhere perhaps is the question of narrative ordering so powerfully posed. We begin that account of the underworld precisely with a catalogue, passage 7 on your handout. Sorry, it's not actually passage 7. I think it's actually the second passage 5, which just shows you that my handout, it's not really a test to check that you're aware, but my handout is a list which lacks any form. But I think it's the second number 5. They're gathered out of Erebos, the ghosts of those that are dead, brides and unwed youths and toil-worn old men, and frisking, so this isn't my translation, I would never say frisking girls, with hearts still new to sorrow, and many too that had been wounded to the spear and slain in battle, wearing blood-stained armor. These came thronging in crowds about the pit from every side. You see there in Greek, that's 42, Paul, Peribothron, Ephoiton, Aulothon, Aulus. Odysseus suggests the mass of the dead, everyone who ever died, by picking out some of the categories: young married women, and old, those killed in battle. The 2 verses given to this last category of those killed in battle evokes to reflect Odysseus' exceptional concern with martial poetry. The ordering, or perhaps disordering, of that catalogue mixes balance with difference, female, male, male, female, male, suggests the overwhelming multitude of the dead. Now, the Alexandrian grammarians aphatized those verses, and some of the reasons given for that can in fact shed light upon Homer's technique and our present concerns in this conference. The first reason given is that the verses do not match what follows when the dead come up to drink the blood, not in a convenient mass, but in categories: women and male heroes. Homer's pattern and Odysseus is a rather different one. The ghosts swarm around in an undifferentiated mass, and it is he, qua narrator, as well as the only empowered living figure in the scene, who must impose order. And this he does by drawing his sword and controlling access to the blood, and hence the order in which we see the ghosts. The categories of ghosts of which the golden ancient grammarians speak are precisely imposed on Odysseus, as is the order in which we see them. Tiresias, Odysseus' mother, the women, the heroes, the sinners, finally Heracles. Order is imposed in narrative, as in lists, by someone, and that order is always an expression of priority or its absence. Geographical lists, like descriptions of journeys, might be thought to impose their own order. Thus, for example, Strabo notes with approval that in describing the desire of Ophis and Ephialtes to storm heaven, Homer, as Strabo says, preserves correct taxes. I've given you the Homeric verses as passage number 6 of the handout. They yearn to pile Ossa on Olympus and Pelion with its waving forests on Ossa, so that heaven might be scaled. What Strabo means is that the 3 mountains are named in a credible sequence. Pelion lies south of Ossa, which in turn lies south of Olympus. Now, Strabo was always at pains to save Homer's accuracy in geographical matters where he could. When he gets, however, to the most famous catalogue of all, the catalogue of ships, he can only say that the cities there are not catalogued in order, that is, in obvious geographical order, because it was not necessary for Strabo. Now, we might think, or perhaps we might hope, that one could do a bit better than that. One of the most attractive features of lists and catalogues is how the threat of disruption always hangs over them and or lurks within them. The very form of a list or catalogue works to conceal the fractures within, what might be called a version of the wood for the trees principle. If you want to get something radical and difficult through a committee, you list it as one of several apparently routine measures to be passed through on the nod. Every chairman knows that. Of course, sometimes the disruptive element insists on calling attention to itself, as, for example, the unburied Elpenor does in the underworld, who precisely disrupts Odysseus's ordering. But as for the catalogue of ships itself, in some ways I'd like to pass over it without discussing it, but that seems hardly possible at this conference. Its importance, of course, is attested, its historical importance, by anecdotes about Greek cities appealing to it to justify territorial and political claims. This is a result both of Homer's authority and, as ancient grammarians noted, the grandeur of the catalogue. But it is also, I think, something to do with the hold that lists have over us. Lists carry an authority of their own. They suggest completeness and correctness. You are either in or you're out, when in fact, of course, lists must always be selective. Homer was both the vehicle and the purpose of Greek education. It was appreciation of Homer which was to confirm Greek identity. But at all educational levels, the 2 Homeric poems were very differentially treated. The Hellenistic and imperial papyri, those which seem to derive from the media of early education, so-called school texts, and those which seem to attest to elite literate culture more broadly, tell a clear enough story. The Iliad was far more important than the Odyssey. And within the Iliad, it was the early books which dominated. The preeminence of the Iliad seems, in fact, to have increased, and the parts of the poems which were commonly read narrowed as the centuries passed. Some parts of the Iliad which are favorites in modern university courses, at least modern university courses that I'm familiar with, for example, books 9, 22, 24, the story of Achilles, in other words, or much less called the catalogue of ships. And that is something which I think might lead to a reflection. The catalogue of ships was in antiquity one of them has read and learned passages of Homer. And it's, of course, very rarely at the top of modern reading lists. Book one of the Iliad was the most familiar and the most used, both simply because it was book one, and probably also because the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon offered teachers rich material for inculcating moral lessons. Now, why the catalogue of ships began with the contingents from Boeotia has been very much discussed, both by ancient grammarians and their modern successors. Is it because Boeotia is imagined to lie in the center of the Greek mainland? Is it because the fleet originally gathered at Aulis in Boeotia? The catalogue reflects that. Is it a favor to the Muses, who were often imagined to dwell on Mount Helicon in Boeotia? Lists and catalogues impose a desire to know and a resistance to the random. The greatest of all ancient grammarians to work on Homer, Aristarchus of Samothrace, had a perhaps unexpected view. Quote, Aristarchus said that Homer began the catalogue of the Boeotians on impulse, not from some special reason. If Homer had begun with another people, we would be looking for the reason for that beginning. It's hard to suppress the feeling there that we have here a wry comment by Aristarchus, not just on the business of Homeric scholarship. Grammarians like Aristarchus himself always want to explain something, even if there is no proper real explanation, but also on the power of the list to convince us that there is order and cosmos. We must never underestimate Aristarchus's sense of humor. There's another famous Greek list in the history of which Aristarchus played a noteworthy part, namely Zeus's list of his sexual conquests, as he seeks to explain to Hera just how powerful is the desire for sex with her that he now feels, unaware, apparently, that this is all part of Hera's cunning plan, passage 7 on your handout. Ancient grammarians were very understandably very much exercised by this passage, and both Aristophanes of Byzantium and Aristarchus atheized the listed example. The reasons given, which may or may not represent the arguments of the great Alexandrians, are that the catalogue of names is untimely and likely to repel rather than attract Hera. Moreover, it's improbable that someone like Zeus, who was so eager for sex, would waste so much time in talking rather than just getting on with it. Now, there's much that I too could say about this list, so that would not necessarily mean that my mind also is elsewhere. 3 quick points, however. First, the grammarians like to point out all the lovers whom Zeus omitted from this list. The list, again, both advertises omissions and encourages completion, but it also stands pars pro toto. Would, in fact, Zeus have been able to give a complete list of his conquests if asked? Would he need 10 mouths and 10 hearts in order to complete that catalogue? Could the god tell the number? I'm not sure. Secondly, there is, as far as we can tell, not so much ancient interest in the ordering of this list, though it must be significant that the 3 undisputed goddesses in the list are placed last. Is this a place of honor or a place of dishonor? And is Hera's view of that matter likely to be the same as ours? To what extent do lists both invite and repel ordering? Finally, how significant in lists are even small breaks in the pattern? We start off with 3 couplets, of which the first verse names the mother and the second the child, or in the third case, children. Then, however, we have a triplet, 1 verse for 2 Theban mothers, and then 1 verse each for their children, Heracles and Dionysus, who are special in all sorts of ways. Lists are, in fact, a provocative challenge to us as critics. Are we to read them or to overread them? Aristarchus might indeed well have felt himself implicated in lists. Lists are important to the scholarly enterprise. It used to be said that Oxford and Cambridge were the only 2 places in the world someone saying to someone else in the street, and ninthly. But lists are also important to the whole idea of literature. It is a familiar idea, which does not also mean that it's correct, that there is only literature as opposed to writings and circulating discourses, when those writings have been collected, catalogued, and listed. Greek antiquity, this leads us, of course, immediately to Ptolemaic Alexandria and the scholarly enterprise of the museum associated by it. The story is too well known to require rehearsing here, but some landmarks again cannot be passed over in silence. Callimachus's Pinaces, or to give them their probably accurate full title, tables of all those who were eminent in any kind of paideia and of their writings in 120 books, probably divided what had been written into broad generic classes. In each class, the authors were presented by name, probably again in alphabetical order. Works could be identified by their opening or their first line. The details are less important than the idea. The process of listing is also the process of creating literary culture. Similar things may be said about the library. Whether or not those in charge aimed at comprehensiveness, and whatever Eastern forerunners and indeed forebears it had, the idea of the library offered a physical dramatization of the idea of literary culture, and it was founded on the idea of the catalogue. Callimachus's greatest and most influential poem, the Aetia, was a poetic list or catalogue of the origins of customs and cult practices from all over the Greek and sometimes non-Greek world. Its avowed model was Hesiod's Theogony, perhaps the most striking instantiation of the poetry as list and catalogue, both on a large scale and also a small one. The catalogue poem in Hesiod is itself filled with included catalogues. There is a constant sense in the poem of the incapacity of one single poem, or perhaps rather one single performance of a or the theogony to embrace everything. Lists and catalogues, as we have already seen, merely advertise their incompleteness. The theogony begins with such an explicit advertisement, and one which is, as we would say, programmatic for the poem which is to follow. This is passage 8 on your handout. The poet describes how the muses celebrate the Olympian gods in song. You see, he finishes them describing their singing all of the gods they sing, but they finish with the holy race of the other immortals who are always are. So that final verse covers for and advertises inevitable incompleteness of the list. And the poet shows their other techniques for suggesting that his list is in fact more comprehensive than it actually is. Before leaving the theogony, we might also note that the muses too have their listing, passage 9 on your handout. It gives us for the first time in Greek literature the names of the 9 muses. Many scholars have argued that Hesiod is here essentially inventing the names. Before him, they were just the muses. The order of the names in that list is certainly, I think, not inevitable. One could, in fact, arrange the names differently to fall into hexameters. But the final position of Calliope is what clearly matters. This is the climax, as is clear both from the explicit statement in verse 80, she looks after kings, and from what follows. Let me return now briefly to Callimachus. Modern scholarship has struggled to make sense of the ordering of the Aetia, or indeed of its two halves. But what is most important, I think, is how Callimachus displays some of the problems of listing and cataloging in a poem which ranges over the whole Greek world. The first item proper of the poem concerns the reason why sacrifice to the graces of Paros is performed without garlands and aulos music. The answer was that when Minos was sacrificing to the graces, news was brought to him of the death of his son Androgeos. Minos piously continued the sacrifice, but told the aulos player to stop, and he took off his sacral garland, thus honoring both the graces and his dead son. The ancient summary of this poem, passage 11 on your handout, tells tells us more about what it contained. The poet says that he heard these things from Clio, and he also heard about the birth of the Graces, that they were born of Dionysus and the Naxian nymph Coronis, after he himself had first said that according to some, they are said to be the children of Hera and Zeus, according to others of Eurynome, the daughter of Okeanos, and Zeus, according to others, Euanthe, the daughter of Uranos and Zeus. What we have here then is a poeticization, presumably with a large dose of ironic humor, of a scholarly practice which we will still readily recognize today. The scholar finds competing accounts and has to make a choice among them. The authority of the choice he makes is, however, not created by the rhetoric of historical argument, but by putting the chosen version directly in the mouth of Clio, the muse who might already have been associated with historiography. That matter is uncertain. The listing of other discarded versions is itself part of the authoritative rhetoric of the historian and of the poet. This was a lesson which, above all, Herodotus and Thucydides had imparted. It is again the list which imposes some kind of control on the overload of information which floats free in the world and stares balefully at the scholar as he or she looks at the library shelves. Callimachus is fond of the device, but the rhetoric, of course, does not come into being with the coming of what we consider the birth of scholarship. Consider the opening of the fragmentary Homeric hymn to Dionysus, passage 12 on your handout. Some say that it was on Dracanos, some on windy Icaros, some on Naxos, and some at Alpheos, that Semele conceived and bore you to Zeus, whose sport was the thunderbolt, while others, Lord, say that it was at Thebes you were born. All false. There is a place called Nysa, and so forth. The poet here presumably does not intend the list of places where Dionysus was not born to be in any sense complete. Far from it. The list of places where Dionysus was not born could never end. We are here, I think, dealing with a style which lends the list an air of completeness, thus enhancing the authority of the poet and answer. Repeat it. Alloy, pseudomine, they're all liars. The pointedly enjabbed pseudomonoi tells a very clear tale. Any sight in the known world will not do, because the god was born far away from mankind in a place of concealment. Now, one of the best preserved fragments of Callimachus's Aetia usually passes under the title On the Cities of Sicily. And here the poet seems to have asked the muses why the city of Zancle, modern Messina, is the only old Greek foundation in Sicily not to invoke its founder by name on ritual occasions. Our surviving fragment, however, shows us much of what leads up to that request, and this is passage 13 on the handout. So here, the poet tells the muse of the stories, of the Sicilian stories that he actually knows before he goes on to make his request for the story that he doesn't know. The enthusiastic and nerdish poet is only too keen to bore the muse with his prodigious knowledge of Sicilian history and cult, but it is the one gap in his omniscience which he desperately wants to be filled. It is the apparent completeness of his list which again advertises what is missing. Now, there are, of course, exceptions to the idea that lists advertise their incompleteness. When political relations are at stake, accuracy and completeness is necessary to trust and the public record. Hence, so many apparently complete lists in the epigraphic record. In such a case, a list stands and falls by its accuracy. A particular version of it is the great list of gifts with which Agamemnon offers to reward Achilles if he will return to the fighting and save the Greeks. Passage 14 on your handout. Agamemnon describes this as countless recompense, aporesia apoina, line 120, but proceeds to spell out the offered gifts with precision and numbering. The public naming, 121 of the gifts is supposed to serve as a guarantee of Agamemnon's good faith. As we all know, however, Achilles took them in a quite different way. Indeed, he took that list as a sign of Agamemnon's bad faith. And the rhetoric with which he rejects them shows precisely the dangers of counting and precision. Passage 15 on your handout. What Achilles wants cannot be put into numbers and lists. His absurd multiplication makes that point. Agamemnon has utterly missed the point. Now, later Greek mathematicians were indeed to find ways of counting the sand. As Achilles said, that's the only, even if you gave me gifts like the sand, I would reject them. Now, Greek mathematicians actually were able later on to count the sand. But Achilles puts what he needs not in terms of numbers, but through a remarkable linguistic singularity. What Agamemnon needs to do is, quote, give back all the thumalgia lobain, the heart-grieving damage. Now, what Achilles actually means by this has been, of course, very much debated. It is the very singularity of the phrase which demands attention. Lists, even such impressive ones as Agamemnon's proffered gifts, advertise the physical reality of what is listed. Agamemnon's offer of marriage to one of his daughters precisely emphasizes the point that what Agamemnon is offering is indeed his to give. It is all there, it can be counted. But who is to count or even describe Achilles' thumalgia lobain? Certainly not Achilles. He tells the ambassadors to go back to the Greek camp and then to come up with a better plan. But he gives them no idea what such a better plan might look like. Now, I was going to go on to talk about lists and the invention of Greek democracy, but looking at the time, and I hope there'll be time for discussion and so forth, I think I'd better abandon democracy. Actually, it's not a bad idea a lot of the time. So we leave that, and I think and this of course brings out what Jeanette didn't call the unavoidable difficulty of concluding, but I think that's where I will conclude in order that we have some time for discussion. Thank you very much.